In the early 2000s, the streets of Lawrence, Massachusetts were being flooded with a cheap and potent version of a very popular illicit good. Profits from this trade were staggering, sometimes ranging in the millions of dollars. Sitting in the cut observing all of this was a feared crew of Dominican stick-up men called the Holo Peros. This organization put fear into the hearts of many traffickers and gave many people in the game sleepless nights. This is the story of the Wolves of Lawrence. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I have a great story for you guys today from the gritty Merrimack Valley city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, or what we like to call in the 978 Law Town. Lawrence is relatively small in size, but it has the second biggest population in Essex County, just behind Lynn. Lawrence is a source city for illicit goods in the Merrimack Valley, while Lynn is one on the North Shore, and they make up large percentages of the population at the local county's Middleton Jail. The city is separated on two sides by the north side and the south side by the mighty Merrimack River. The river is the whole reason Lawrence grew so large and attracted so many immigrant groups throughout the generations. There are numerous mills and factories throughout the city. The mills along the Merrimack Valley were instrumental in the industrialization of the United States. But by the 1980s, many of these mills had closed, and as unemployment climbed, a new industry emerged in the city: narco trafficking. This is what Lawrence has unfortunately become famous for, and most recently, in the last few decades. Starting in the late 1960s and early 70s, Puerto Ricans who originally came into Massachusetts as migrant farmers throughout the Connecticut River Valley moved further east throughout the Commonwealth looking for permanent work. After establishing large centers in Holyoke and Springfield, they moved east working in factories in Worcester, Fitchburg, Leominster, Gardner, and especially the Merrimack Valley. The mills and factories in Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill attracted many Puerto Ricans to the area. When the mills began to slow down and eventually closed, many of the Irish, Italian, Greek, Polish, and French Canadians that had moved to the cities for work now moved out to different suburbs or other cities, after which many more Puerto Ricans moved into Lawrence especially. In the 1980s, Lowell became one of the biggest narco hubs in the area. So much so that HBO made a documentary about it starring former boxer Dickie Eklund, Mickey Ward's brother who Christian Bale played in the movie The Fighter alongside Mark Wahlberg. But by the end of the 80s, much of the action had moved to next door Lawrence. By the time the 90s rolled around, more and more people went to Lawrence to cop. By the turn of the 2000s, it was one of the biggest source cities in all of New England. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, street crews that originally started in Chicago ended up operating on the Lawrence streets. I'm not exactly sure of the origins, but I do know that many New Yorkers moved from the Bronx and Washington Heights neighborhoods to Lawrence, and that's perhaps how the Latin Kings ended up there anyways. But there were also the GDs, which back in the day went by LGD in Lawrence, the L standing for Latin. And there was also a homegrown crew called the Outlaws. I knew a guy named Don P. who was one of the original members of the Outlaws. But these crews eventually hooked up with Dominican traffickers as more and more Dominicans were moving into Lawrence and the Merrimack Valley in general. Lawrence especially became a hub for Latinos. By the turn of the millennium, even though Holyoke was the original heart of Puerto Rican Massachusetts and still strongly identifies with their Boricua heritage, Lawtown overwhelmingly has the largest Latino population, not only in Massachusetts, but all of New England at 80% of the population. It's pretty hard to miss once you enter the Lawrence city limits that it's a Latino city. This makes the majority white clientele that comes to the city stick out to the police, especially when they have out-of-state license plates. By the first decade of the 2000s, people were driving from New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont every day to cop in Lawrence. What's up, everybody? I figured I'd just jump in here real quick and say hi. And also, I figured I couldn't talk about Lawrence, Massachusetts one more time without at least briefly mentioning LTS, which was Licensed to Steal, a legendary crew from like the 90s. I think they were pretty much done by the first decade of 2000s, but they specialized in stealing cars and selling them. There's chop shops all around. People used to want to buy it. It was specialized in stealing like I think like Hondas and Toyotas, which were real big back on the streets back in the days. Just chop them up and sell them for parts and all types of things. It was a huge underground economy, and then like it was like their own little thing. And LTS is just a legendary crew from Lawrence. So if anybody wants to see a future video of that, people like a lot of people do. They've mentioned it before, and whenever I talk about Lawrence and I don't mention them, people hammer me on in the comments about it. So if you want to see a future video about it, hit me up on social media. If you're around during that time period, if you have good information about it, and you want to see the video made, find me on social, hit me up, and we'll get it done. Thanks a lot. In the past decade or so, Vermont has come under siege from crews coming up the I-91 corridor from Hartford, Springfield, and Holyoke. Crews from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and beyond have seen the promise in the untouched markets of rural northern New England. In many parts of Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, unemployment is high and there's not much to do. Life is very slow and people want to escape. Addiction has run rampant in these states in the past few decades, and the southern source cities have contributed to the problem heavily. Southern New Hampshire has become absolutely saturated with product being right across the border from Lawrence. As the first decade of the 2000s came to an end, more and more Dominicans had moved into Lawrence, outgrowing the Puerto Rican population in the city. Lawtown actually has one of the highest concentrations of the Dominicans in North America outside of their home island. As more and more money was being made and territory expanded, Dominican traffickers got more involved in the street level sales. They were very businesslike and efficient. They didn't use themselves and they made a lot of money. Soon neighboring cities like Methuen and Haverhill and across the New Hampshire border into Salem, Nashua, and especially Manchester, aka Manch Vegas, were under the control of these traffickers. By the mid 20 teens, southern New Hampshire had one of the highest OD rates in the entire country. Of course, where there is money being made illegally, there will be people looking to steal those ill gotten gains. The stick up boy has always been an integral piece of the puzzle in the so called game. In my opinion, The Wire from HBO is one of the best depictions of how the narco trade works, and one of the most popular and infamous characters from that show was the feared stick up man Omar. Rest in peace, Michael Kenneth Williams. While these Dominican traffickers were stacking up cash, wolves were waiting in the shadows to rob them. Cue the Holo Peros, a vicious crew of mostly Dominican stick-up men that terrorized dealers, traffickers, money launderers, business owners, family members. It didn't matter. If you were tied into the narco business directly or indirectly, it didn't matter to the Holo Peros. If you were making money or cleaning illegal money, they were going to rob you for it. Plain and simple. This crew is as smart as they were brutal and targeted Dominicans, especially because they were vulnerable. While Puerto Ricans are considered American citizens, Dominicans are not. Not only this, but many of the Dominicans in Lawrence and other Merrimack Valley cities were here illegally. Some had already even been deported and were back in the US with fake identities. The Joloperros targeted these people specifically because of their legal status in America. They assumed correctly that they would not go to the authorities. Even if they were here legally, I think there's a certain level of distrust between newer immigrant groups and the authorities. I'm not saying that distrust is unfounded. The Joloperos went to work, and by 2010, word was beginning to spread about their exploits. CIs were telling detectives in Lawrence that people were disappearing off the city streets and being held for ransom or being brutalized until they gave up vital information on the whereabouts of large sums of cash and uncut product. The police were intrigued by these reports because, just as the Joloperos had bet on, none of the victims or their families contacted the authorities. They just dealt with the problem internally. As more and more reports came off the street depicting the same story, more or less, the Lawrence detectives, along with the support of a special FBI North Shore task force, began their own investigation into exactly what was happening on the streets of Lawrence. What they discovered was one of the most sophisticated and terrifying stick up crews in Massachusetts history. Just like the police, the Joloperos surveilled their targets, following them for weeks, sometimes even months. As the feds would later discover after raiding one of their strongholds, the Joloperos kept extensive records on their targets. They collected all types of information on these Dominican DTOs as if they were conducting their own investigations. Only instead of trying to put the crews in prison, they were setting them up for robbery. The Joloperos followed these organizations from top to bottom, finding out who is who. I'm sure they had their own team of paid informants out on the street collecting info for them. They wanted to find out locations of stash houses around the Merrimack Valley where they could find large amounts of uncut product and cash. They also chased just the money side of the organizations as well, finding out who was laundering the money for them, what businesses were being used as fronts. Some were even legitimate, thriving businesses that still washed a little money on the side, maybe for friends and family. You have to understand we're talking about figures into the hundreds of thousands up to millions of dollars. The stakes were very high in this game, and there was a lot of money being made in the Merrimack Valley. By 2012, the Lawrence detectives, along with the FBI and other agencies, were getting closer and closer to the Joloperos and their operation. They were being told that many times the Joloperos were disguising themselves as police or some other form of law enforcement. People thought they were getting raided before it was too late, and they were already blindfolded and zip-tied, realizing what was truly taking place. CIs also told authorities that the Joloperos were using sophisticated GPS trackers, especially for 2011 and 12, that they were attaching onto the cars of their targets so they could track their comings and goings. This is how the Joloperos found the location of many stash houses in the Merrimack Valley. This was a level of professionalism that authorities had never seen before in this area. The federal government decided to go after the Joloperros very aggressively, fearing that the crew would only grow stronger and develop to a higher level of sophistication if left to continue uninterrupted. While investigating the crew, authorities got a break in 2012 when they got a live report that two men had been taken in broad daylight off the street in Lawrence by force and thrown into a van. Even better for the authorities, they were able to find out the location to where the Joloperos were bringing the men. The location was a dingy building in Manchester, New Hampshire. The feds stormed the building, rescuing a man who was being menaced with a hot iron and arresting the Joloperos members that were present. The feds began to pull on this loose string they had finally found in the organization and began to dismantle it. Upon searching one of the Joloperos headquarters, the authorities were shocked to find computers with files and files of info on the crew's targets. They had indeed been placing GPS trackers on the cars of their victims and tracking them via computer. They also found various law enforcement uniforms, weapons, handcuffs, zip ties, blindfolds, etc. It was shocking to the task force. They had never seen anything like it before in the Merrimack Valley. Members of the Holo Peros were arrested and sentenced, with lower ranking members up to lieutenants getting anywhere from 5 years to multiple decades in prison. But the feared leader of the crew, Danny Velos, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That's how much the authorities feared the Joloperos crew, aka the Wolves of Lawrence. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, leave a comment if you want to see a future video. If you have an idea for one, just leave in the comments. We'll see what we can do. Join me on all other forms of social media as I share and write blogs and all different types of stuff, about this different Massachusetts lore that you guys love to hear about. But most importantly, you guys know, as I always say in my videos, make good decisions, make good choices, be good to yourself, your friends, your family, your fellow human beings. Try to have a good day, guys. I'll see you real soon in another video. Take care, and God bless.